What's up guys, I'm Nick of CamCrunch, and in today's video we are going to talk about exposure compensation. Now I actually did a sort of tutorial of exposure compensation in one of my previous videos. It was actually one of my first videos where I did a tutorial on aperture priority, so I'll leave that in the description box down below. But this one will just be talking about exposure compensation as a whole and how you can adjust it in your DSLR, whether you're using a prosumer DSLR like my 6D or something like the Rebel series. And this will also transfer to other brands as well, like Nikon or whatever other brands you're using. Adjusting exposure compensation is very similar among brands. So first, let's start with what exposure compensation is. Now, as you guys know, in your camera, in your DSLR, aside from having full manual and just full auto, you'll have some modes that are sort of in between, and these are called semi-automatic exposure modes. You have program, where your camera basically adjusts your aperture and your shutter speed, but you usually can change your ISO within the menu, so that's semi-automatic. And then you have aperture priority, where you adjust your aperture and the camera will adjust the shutter speed to get the correct exposure. And then the shutter speed priority, which is the same as aperture priority, except you adjust the shutter speed and then your camera adjusts the aperture. Now, within these modes, your camera is giving you what it thinks should be the correct exposure based on the metering mode that you're using, whether that's the evaluative or spot metering or center weighted metering. It will give you different exposures depending on what meter setting you're using, but it will give you what it thinks is the best exposure. Now, sometimes you're not happy with that exposure, and some people think that you actually don't get to adjust it beyond what the camera gives you, but you can actually adjust your exposure even when you're using the semi-automatic exposure modes like aperture priority, shutter priority, and program mode, and that is through exposure compensation. So exposure compensation is basically a way that you can adjust your exposure after your camera has given the initial exposure which it thinks should be the exposure for your scene. And this will be good for compensating for maybe backlit scenarios or nighttime scenarios where you're overexposed because the camera's trying to meter for middle gray, and different scenarios like that. And essentially, if you're just not happy with what the camera gives you, you can make the image brighter or darker and then take another image. So that's what exposure compensation is used for. So here I have my camera and it is set to aperture priority. It's on AV. That means that I can change my aperture using this dial up here. You can see it's 3.5, 4.5, 5.6. So I can change my aperture up here and then take a shot, and the camera will sort of give me what it thinks is a good shot. So that is just a quick shot of the pillows. I know it's not clear, but that's what it thinks the correct exposure should be. And now, right now, my exposure compensation is right in the middle. That is 0. So what you can do is, if you have a prosumer camera like this, you usually have a second dial. And when you're using one of the semi-automatic exposure modes, when you're using one of these cameras, the second dial is for exposure compensation. So another shot, if I think that's too bright, I can lower the exposure compensation. So right now it says -1, which means it's lowering the exposure compensation to -1 stops. So it's going to make it darker essentially. You can take another picture and then you can see it's darker now. Now the light, you can see, is sort of bright. These shadows that are being casted, they're properly exposed, but now the pillows are a little bit darker where the shadows are. You can also overexpose, so right now we're going to go back. This is 0 exposure compensation, so that's what the camera thinks it should be. And then we can make it bright, so +1 stop. And now you can see it's brighter. So I almost forgot to show you guys how to use exposure compensation on a DSLR that doesn't have 2 dials like the 6D, which I'm filming on right now. And I apologize that the sound quality is a little bit less good right now, and that's because I do not have the mic attached to the 6D. But as you guys know, some of you guys with one of these DSLRs that do not have a second dial, you just have like sort of that one primary dial in the front. How do you adjust exposure compensation? Because when you use this dial in a semi-automatic exposure mode, this one will adjust your aperture, let's say if you're in aperture priority. Well, you'll usually have a button in the back, and this button usually says AV or has this exposure compensation sign. The exposure compensation has a plus and a minus, and that is the button that you press, and then while you're pressing it, you turn the dial, and that usually activates exposure compensation. So here, I'll try to get up closer. That is the button that you have to press, and then you spin the dial to adjust your exposure compensation. So again, you'll use this main dial to adjust your exposure, to adjust your aperture, let's say if you're in aperture priority, or your shutter speed when you're in shutter speed priority, but then you'll use this button right here to adjust your exposure compensation. You'll hold this and then you'll spin the dial while you're holding it. So that's basically what exposure compensation does in a nutshell. So if you are using one of these semi-automatic exposure modes, I highly encourage you guys to try using exposure compensation, because it makes shooting with one of these semi-automatic modes a much more pleasurable experience, and it will give you much better results that are tailored to exactly what you want. So that's it, guys. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, definitely give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video.